Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Welcome to Northern Lights. I'm Phebe Hanson, and I'm here with Patricia Hampl in her beautiful office in a townhouse called Riley Row. And do you remember, Patricia, that we're now sitting just a block from where we first met in 1973, January. It's exactly 28 years ago that we first met.
I do remember, and I often don't remember moments like that, but I do remember meeting you at Women Poets of the Twin Cities meeting. I don't know if that organization still exists,
yes,
but it was very important, and it drew together a lot of people.
And it drew us together. I was a poet just starting out late in life, in my mid-40s.
Which is to say, younger than, by 10 years than I am now.
Yes, impossible as that seems. And you were a young poet, just starting out, but already published, I believe. And you had come to St. Paul from the Iowa Writers Workshop. And I was very much in awe of you, but for some reason we hit it off, despite our age difference and the difference in the stages of our career. I remember being impressed by the fact that you said you always knew that you wanted to be a writer. I hadn't known it until I was in my mid-40s, but is this true?
Yes, I always liked to write. I always felt writing was something that made sense of everything. And so even, I mean, I carry forward not a career of being a writer, but just the idea of writing and doing that as a passion. And then when I got old enough to think of a career, I thought, well, I guess you become a journalist, because I thought poets, which was what I liked to write, was poetry. I thought, well, it appears that they decide you're a poet after you're dead. So you can't exactly decide to be one in your lifetime. But then I did work in journalism for a while, and then I started writing poetry and started meeting other poets, and I remember how astonished I was that people would actually call themselves poets and just be walking around on the street. So then I decided, well, maybe I could be a poet too, and I started writing poetry and went to the Writers' Workshop, and then came back home to Minnesota, to St. Paul, and began living here and working here.
And you're living much the same neighborhood that you grew up in. We're within, as we used to say sometimes, the shadow of the cathedral, but I think of it as being in the light of the cathedral and being able to hear those wonderful cathedral bells from time to time.
It's very important to me.
Now, you started out as a poet, but one of the vivid memories I have of our times together was when we were at maybe it was a couple of years after we first met, at Cecil's Deli in Highland Park. And we were both avid journal keepers, so we would read aloud to each other from our journals, and you said, I have something I want to read to you. And tell the rest of the story.
Well, I think we have different versions of this.
Slightly different versions.
But anyway, my version is that I read something to you. It was actually about a teacup.
It was about a teacup.
It was a description of a teacup. And my idea was I wanted to start writing prose. I had been writing poetry. The only prose that I wrote was in my journal. So I thought, well, you know, artists, when they want to learn how to paint, will set up a still life and paint that. So I happened to be drinking tea, and I thought, I'm going to describe this teacup. So it was a teacup that had been actually given to me by my mother, and I described it at great length, and in it came some story about my mother and so forth. I sort of made it up, though, as I was going. It wasn't all conversation we'd actually had. And I finished reading it to you, and you said...
I said, type that baby up and send it to the New Yorker. wasn't quite that easy. I think you had to do a few more things with it before you sent it off to New York.
But this was in the days when we did type things up. There were no computers yet.
No.
And so I did type it up. I did send it to the New Yorker in a manila envelope. I had no agent or anything like that. And to everyone's astonishment, but mine most of all, it was accepted by the editor, the fiction editor of the New Yorker, Roger Angel, and it was published in the New Yorker, thereby astonishing everyone and making me something called a writer suddenly.
Something of a celebrity. Because it was a great coup to be published in the New Yorker. Your very first, almost your very first publication.
Well, it was the first big publication.
And by then we were calling it a short story, even though it had come out of a journal entry, and it had memoir in it.
It did have memoir, but I didn't know the word memoir really then, and I only knew this was prose, and it kind of had a story to it, and it wasn't really exactly my life, but it was sort of my life. It was autobiographical fiction, but it was published as a short story, and it was later published in the Best American Short Stories. So I suddenly had this strange one-story identity as a short story writer, but I began being drawn away from fiction towards some of the subjects that had been implicit in that very first story, which had to do with Prague and Czechoslovakia. The teacup had come from Czechoslovakia, and I had written about it in terms of the history of that place.
Well, I remember well, too, when we were together as our friendship grew. We ended up spending summers together often at the North Shore of Lake Superior in our beloved Gunnarson's cabin resort. And I seem to remember you reading portions of your next book aloud to me as we sat on the rocks outside our cabins. You wrote then on a yellow pad. I can still see the yellow pad. I was very impressed with the fact that you wrote on a yellow pad. I don't know why. With a Pilot razor point pen.
Yes.
You would bring up dozens of them. And your old typewriter.
Mm-hmm.
We both had typewriters. And it was the beginning, these were the beginnings of a romantic education.
Yeah, and a romantic education was written and researched, and all the travel to Czechoslovakia, all of that was done during really the depths of the Cold War in the 70s, and was published in 1981.
Yes, and I know you once referred to that as the book that would not die because it's been reissued several times.
It has, because I thought when the Velvet Revolution happened in 1989, November, I thought, well, now finally this book will go out of print because it isn't accurate to the world there anymore. But my publisher called and said, how would you like to go back over and do an afterword, and we'll do a whole new edition? Well, I said, my bags are packed.
Yes.
I ran over there. And in fact, I've been going over to Prague now every year for a month in the summer since then. And so I have an apartment there. I really am there in a much more, oddly enough, I've been there a lot more since the revolution than I was to write the book. Then in 1990, that came out in 1992. In 1999, the book had finally gone out of print in 1998. And my new publisher, W.W. Norton, said, we'd like to do a new edition of A Romantic Education. How would you like to go over there again and do another afterward? So I did another afterward in honor of the 10th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution, and that book came out. And in some way, I know that's the end of it, because it really feels as if I brought to conclusion some of the mysteries and narrative lines that were way back there in 1981, finally got settled and solved, partly because some people died in this edition of 1999.
Yes. Well, I don't want it to ever die. I want it to keep and stay in print forever.
Well, I hope it stays in print.
But then you went on to publish a book of poems about the North Shore, partly, resort and other poems. And after that, you became, as I call it, obsessed with the life of cloistered nuns. And you wrote Virgin Time.
Yeah, I got married and I became obsessed with the lives of cloistered nuns. Yes. I'm not quite sure what the relationship is there, but never mind.
Tell us about the writing of that book.
Well, I knew when I was writing A Romantic Education, which is essentially a memoir of an ethnic background, a Czech American who grew up in St. Paul and who goes back to the old country.
Right.
I knew while I was writing that there was another story I had to tell, and it had to do with being Catholic, with being brought up Catholic. So these were sort of my bookends. And so I always knew I would write this other book about growing up Catholic. What I didn't realize was that growing up Catholic wasn't in my past. It was part of who I was at that moment. And I became very interested in the idea of contemplative prayer, contemplative life, the choice for a prayer life and a life really very different from the life I led and continue to lead. But I really wanted to pursue that. And so I wrote this book both about the past but also about the question of why does anybody pray? What is prayer anyway? And what does it look like in our times?
Well, I remember that back in romantic education, you talk about more or less leaving the Catholic Church.
Absolutely. I thought I did.
And what really brought you back, and then brought you back to Virgin time, actually?
Well,
I knew you all those years, but I don't remember. It seems like you've always been going out to the monastery of the Poor Clares.
I know, but there was a time when I would not even go into a Catholic church, even to see the art. I was that strongly anti-Catholic. And I think it's very typically cradle Catholic behavior to kind of have old-fashioned upbringing to rebel against that. But in fact, it's part of my making. It's who I am. I feel I could no more say I'm not Catholic than most Jewish people feel about saying they're Jewish, no matter how they decide to practice or observe their faith. Or it's an identity, and it's more something I follow than something I believe. It's not as if I can say, okay, I believe these 3 things and I don't believe those 6 things. It has more to do with a real sense of wanting to pursue this background that is kind of hardwired into me.
Yes. And Virgin time took you on some travels too.
That was my Italian book. That time,
yes.
I had enough of, pork roast and sauerkraut in the Czech Republic at that time. Well, it was Czechoslovakia. And I decided I wanted to go to Italy and in pursuit of St. Francis. And it was a magical thing. And it was, there were 2 places I thought I could go. One was to Italy and St. Francis, and the other one was to Ireland.
Right.
And I knew I didn't want to do Ireland because so many people have written about Ireland, including the Irish, and it's a different, frankly, it's a different Catholicism. It's a different, what the Catholics call charism, a different kind of identity. And I thought I really wanted one that was a little more southern. And so
felt more drawn to St.
And I love
Francis
St. Francis.
St. Patrick, for instance.
I did, even though I'm named for St. Francis, or for St. Patrick.
And all this while, you were also writing essays.
Yes.
And about a year, I think it's 2 years, or it's 2 years ago almost, that I Could Tell You Stories came out, your wonderful collection of essays. Some are memoiristic essays. Did that book get started, when you first started writing essays, you had probably no idea that you were going to come up with a book, or did you?
I did.
Okay.
In fact, just as I thought that Virgin Time, and I have to admit I hate that title, but anyway, there it is.
It seems right.
But my Catholic book, as I call it, was going to come after this Czech book. In other words, I saw those 2 as matched. I knew once I was in the midst of that I had a 3rd book. So I really see I Could Tell You Stories as the 3rd in a trilogy of memoirs.
Interesting.
And the 3rd book, I Could Tell You Stories, is really, it's 2 things. On the one hand, it's if I were writing fiction in these books, those first 2 books would be novels. They're single narrative books. You read start at the beginning, you read to the end. It's one story in both cases. And then I Could Tell You Stories would be, if it were fiction, a book of short stories. It's the short form of the memoir. But in addition to that, it's also my attempt not to talk about being Catholic, not to talk about being, what an ethnic background in America is about. It's about memory itself. Because once I'd written those 2 memoirs, or once I was in the midst of writing them, I really understood that the real subject of every memoir is memory itself, and the mystery of memoir, the mystery of memory.
Right.
Because memory and imagination and dream, those 3 things are the 3 forms that the human mind has for story and for creativity. And the 2 that interest me most are memory and imagination. And so I really wanted to write about that. I felt to write about memory was to write another memoir. So now I feel like I've done those 3 books, and I can imagine writing, other memoiristic pieces, but I really feel that part of my writing life is now, it's on the shelf.
Well, one of my favorite essays in that book is the last one, Other People's Secrets, Maybe you could talk a little bit about what it's like to be a memoirist and be writing about family and friends and
former friends.
And former friends. Do you lose friends?
You do lose friends. I did. I have. And I had to address that question. And I had to, interestingly enough, address that question in this piece, Other People's Secrets, by not then, once again, betraying their trust.
Yes.
So it was a very complicated issue. And the person I chose to focus on most was my mother.
Yes.
Because I really feel that I've used her, and sometimes I'd have to say abused her, in my writing. Yeah. She's allowed me to do it in a way, but it's been hard for her, and I wrote about that at great length. And then I talked about other people who've had the same problem. I don't know anybody who is a writer who doesn't face this question of
whether they write fiction or non-fiction.
Fiction or nonfiction.
Or poetry.
Or poetry. It doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't.
The friends, the family who say, how dare you? How could you?
Yes.
Or you may not.
You took my life.
You took my life. And many writers don't allow themselves to write certain things. I'm sure I fall into that category without even knowing it in some ways, until certain people are gone, or maybe never. So it was something I felt I had to contend with. Yes. And I wrote that essay while my mother was very, very sick. I didn't know if she would survive. She did. And I showed it to her. And she had a hard time with it, but she's always been very supportive of me and my work, and was able to once again make the sacrifice of her own privacy for me.
Yes, yes. It's a beautiful essay, as are all the essays in that book. And now, your latest publication is a short story. And I remember you through the years, while you were writing poetry and while you were writing memoir, also writing short stories. You've been writing short stories for quite a few years, but except for that first one in the New Yorker, I don't think any of them have been published until The Summer House, which came out as a winter book from the Minnesota Center for Book Arts. You want to talk about how, well, that was commissioned.
Well, what was commissioned was something.
Something. It wasn't necessarily going to have to be a short story.
I have a feeling that they may not have expected me to say, well, guess what?
Your winter book's going to be The Summer House.
Yeah, well, that was a little perverse to call the winter book The Summer House. But I wanted to focus, after doing all this work in memoir and nonfiction, I wanted to write fiction. I knew that. I knew all along I would do it. And in fact, I had published a few stories here and there.
Yes.
But I knew I wanted my next book to be a book of short stories. I had originally thought a novel, and I do have a novel somewhere.
I thought so.
In the computer part of it, and in my head the rest of it. But I felt I needed to work on short forms, that I would feel more at home. Mm-hmm. It's closer to the poetic impulse. It's closer to what I feel I could do right now. And I do love short stories so much. So I suggested that I do a short story for the winter book, and no one said no. So that's what I wrote and sent to them, and they set it in this beautiful format in the winter book.
Well, good evening and welcome to Minnesota Center for Book Arts' 12th annual Winter Book Publication Party. And I do feel the spirit rising here, and thank you for that. I'm Peggy Korsmo-Kennan, the Executive Director of MCBA, and I really am glad to see so many friends and colleagues, supporters here to celebrate this publication, which is a wonderful counter-seasonal story. You know, I couldn't think of, but there is something about today turning so cold, and to be able to have a winter book that makes you think of warmth, the warmth of summer. And it's The Summer House by Patricia Hampl.
It's a great pleasure for me to do this year's winter book. I had heard rumors that there were lots of icicles and fish houses and a lot of darkness and death in earlier winter books. So I thought maybe if I set my work in the summer, we might have a chance to cheer up a little bit.
In acknowledging the folks that are a part of this and that make this all happen, I, of course, always must start with Patricia Hampl, and the authors of winter books, because they're the starting point. I learned in the process of marketing this publication nationally that we're one of the few places, in fact the only place, that does a collaborative book of this sort that begins with text. A lot of places, the author and illustrator and artist are all one person. They've sometimes chosen text by someone else, but here we start with the words and we let the words dictate the direction in which we go, which is sometimes a very scary and daunting process, but without the contribution of Patricia Hampl, we certainly wouldn't have been able to get where we are.
It was really a collaborative project where everyone got to work on it. I guess the printing was great because Patricia's had experience with letterpress printing before, and she really understood what we were doing, and she was also very helpful. She gave us handwriting for the project that we incorporated into the text of the book, and I want to thank her for that. And along the way, she was always very helpful with making decisions in the design of the book, too. It's a great experience working with her.
I enjoy working with the interaction between the various people that are working on the book, because it's interesting to hear how other people see things.
And it's astonishing to see that not only has she become, over the years, one of the most brilliant poets and the most brilliant essayists and critics, that Patricia Hampl has shown us tonight that she can write brilliant fiction. This is a story that I hope will become a centerpiece of a wonderful new collection, and that she will continue to grow as a writer. And as she does, I believe that her work will stand as a monument to all the things that I personally find important in a writer, and that kind of keen eye and attention to detail, and a narrative flow that makes her work so extraordinary. I believe her work is a monument to the English language itself.
Bruce's idea, he found the place near Marine, north of St. Paul, and then astonished Elaine by taking it for the entire summer when they decided, after all, to get back together. "You'll love it," he said. "One of those great old cottages from the 20s right on the river." He wanted to throw some money around, he said. "Celebrate. Find a getaway. Just the two of us." A dodgy thought darted through Elaine's mind. Just where did this getaway talk come from? Did he and Janice have getaways? Was flight now always to be part of the poetry of love? The house sat on the bluff edge of the St. Croix, an area she had known since childhood. Years ago, her father used to take the family for breakfast picnics at a bluff outcropping nearby called the Boom. He scrambled eggs in a cast-iron frying pan. Was that it? You couldn't build a house this close to the river anymore, Bruce had told her, pride in his voice. They would live all summer amid the lush coolness of open casement windows, the wood mullions painted deep green, the grassy river below, the interior split log walls caulked with creamy seams, lovers in our getaway. There was a fireplace. Maybe evenings would be cool. She had packed candles for the dinner table. "It doesn't have a telephone," Bruce had said the week before, as if this were not a deficiency, but an amenity he had artfully arranged. Of course, he had his cell phone always. "But I'm powering off when we're out there," he said. This, too, had been delivered as if it were an accomplishment.
And now I'm going off just in a few days, later in January of this year, 2001.
I'm already starting to mourn your departure.
Well, I'll come back with any luck.
Well,
but
I might come see you.
You might come see me, would be better yet. I'm going off to the south of France, to the Camargo Foundation, and I'm going with nothing but stories in my head to write, and I hope when I come home, I'll have a book to give my editor, and she hopes so too.
I hope so too.
I'm really looking forward to this time in Cassis in the south of France, partly because, to do my own work, of course, on these stories, but also because this is the exact area where Catherine Mansfield, who's one of my earliest and most abiding heroes of the short story, spent her winters when she was trying to get away from the northern winters when she had tuberculosis. And I'm planning to write an essay, an appreciation of Catherine Mansfield. And it's also where, of course, Fitzgerald wrote Gatsby and where he set Tender is the Night. And I'm hoping to write about him as well. So I feel like I'll be surrounded by my my favorite ghosts.
So you started out, when I first knew you, you were writing in a journal and on those wonderful legal pads. Now, how do you write? You have this beautiful office now. When I first knew you were writing on your kitchen table.
Yes.
And if you weren't handwriting, you were writing. Did you have a Smith Corona?
I did.
That's what I had too.
Yeah.
We loved our little typewriters.
Now I have a Mac.
And now you have a Mac. So tell us what your writing day is like. I mean, do you write faithfully every day? Or
Not,
I hope not.
I don't necessarily. I really am somebody who is deadline directed.
Right. Okay.
And I love to come up to this room. I consider it my sanctuary.
It's a wonderful room.
And when I'm in this room, no matter what I'm doing, it's part of my writing life. Whether I'm writing letters of recommendation for other people, blurbs for the back of other people's books, in my journal, reading, whatever I'm doing, it's taking notes, it's part of my writing life. And I don't, then when I have to sit down and do something, I'm full speed ahead. Maybe I work late at night, maybe I'm up here every morning.
Yes.
But I don't necessarily always attend to my story or my essay or my poem or whatever it is I'm doing. I may actually do something for somebody else, but I always consider myself to be in my writing life when I'm in this room.
And you are a teacher. You're a Regents professor at the University of Minnesota. Right now you're not teaching.
I'm on sabbatical, and now I've changed a little. I only teach in the fall semester. So I'm really only at the university from the 1st of, let's say, September till shortly before Christmas. So and then I go around the country a lot. I give readings. I teach every year in the Prague summer seminars for 2 weeks or so in the summer. And then I go different places. And
you like to go away for extended periods of time, too. So you used to go to the North Shore.
Yeah, I still do that. And I still have my fondest desire. I mean, I have no right to have any desires because I have a wonderful life. Just very, as the wonderful poet Gerald Stern said, lucky, lucky life. I have one. Yes. But I do have a hope someday to have a cabin at the North Shore.
Good.
Because I still feel that's home.
That's home. That's one of your places.
This is home, too.
This is home, too. St. Paul has always been your home, hasn't it? You were born here.
Yeah.
And I imagine you as I sit here in this wonderfully comfortable chair, writing at your computer, maybe even in your journal. And in this chair, I've usurped the chair from your wonderful white standard poodle Lily.
Well, I'm afraid that used to be the chair I sat in to write and read, but it's now become Lily's chair.
She took it over from you.
I tend to sit here or someplace else, and Lily does her work in that chair at ease, which is her happiest way to be.
Happiest way to be. Well, thank you.
What a joy to be with you, Phoebe, always.
Together. Thank you. I've been here with Patricia Hampl in her home in St. Paul. Thank you for tuning in to Northern Lights, and please join us again.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.